At midnight, the Mafia boss opened his door and saw his ex-wife standing there, holding a newborn and a suitcase. He thought leaving her would protect them both, but what he didn't know was the secret she carried and the danger that had followed him home. Tonight, nothing will ever be the same. Welcome back to Heartwoven Tales. I'm Selena. I hope you're doing well, and a very Merry Christmas to each one of you. May your hearts be filled with love, your days with hope, and may you always find light even in the darkest moments. Today's story is full of emotion, suspense, and choices that will keep you on the edge. So stay with me till the very end. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more heartfelt stories. Now, let's dive in. Midnight had always been Maxwell Moretti's safest hour. It was the moment when the city quieted just enough to feel distant but never dead, when the chaos of the streets softened into a low, harmless hum far below his penthouse windows. He trusted this hour because nothing unexpected survived in it. No meetings, no calls, no emotions demanding space. He had shaped his life around control, and silence was the purest form of it. From where he stood, the city looked unreal, glowing and restless, as if it were something alive that could be watched without being touched. He liked that separation. It reminded him that everything dangerous stayed outside these walls. The penthouse itself reflected that philosophy. Clean lines, cold marble, furniture chosen for function, not comfort. Nothing here invited someone to stay longer than necessary. Even the lights were dimmed strategically, soft enough to ease the eyes, sharp enough to reveal movement instantly. Maxwell had learned long ago that comfort dulled instincts, and dulled instincts got people buried. He stood by the window, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, not drinking it, just holding it out of habit. Habits were predictable. Predictability kept him alive. When the knock came, it didn't belong to the night. It wasn't loud, it wasn't frantic. It carried no hesitation, no fear. It was sharp, deliberate, confident enough to be unsettling. Maxwell froze, not because he was afraid, but because the sound didn't fit any pattern he recognized. Enemies announced themselves with violence. Friends never arrived uninvited. Business was handled elsewhere. This knock existed outside all categories, and that alone put his body on alert before his mind caught up. His grip tightened slightly around the glass as he turned toward the door, irritation rising faster than curiosity. He didn't reach for a weapon. That was what bothered him most. Something about the knock told him he wouldn't need one. The walk to the door felt longer than it should have, his footsteps echoing faintly in the open space. He told himself it was just an interruption, an inconvenience to be dealt with and forgotten. He had buried greater disruptions than this. Still, when his hand closed around the handle, a strange resistance settled in his chest, an unfamiliar hesitation that had nothing to do with caution and everything to do with instinct. For the first time in years, Maxwell hesitated before opening a door. When he finally did, the night rushed in like a held breath released. Sarah stood there. For a moment, his mind refused to process what his eyes were seeing. She looked thinner than he remembered, paler, as if exhaustion had settled into her bones and refused to leave. Her hair was pulled back carelessly, not styled, not considered, strands escaping around her face. She wasn't crying. She wasn't angry. That was worse. She stood perfectly still, holding a small bundle against her chest, with a steadiness that felt practiced, necessary. At her feet sat a single suitcase, worn at the edges, as if it had been dragged through more than one place it never meant to stop. The world narrowed to the space between them. Maxwell's breath left his body in a slow, silent exhale, the kind that comes after impact. His instincts failed him completely. There was no script for this moment, no plan, no strategy, just the unbearable weight of recognition. This wasn't a ghost. This wasn't memory. This was Sarah, standing at his door at midnight, looking at him as if he were the last option left, not the first choice she had ever wanted. Then he noticed the baby. The child was asleep, nestled against her chest, impossibly small, wrapped in soft fabric that contrasted violently with the cold steel and marble behind him. One tiny hand rested near Sarah's collarbone, fingers curled loosely, trusting the world without knowing it yet. The sight struck Maxwell harder than any weapon ever had. His body reacted before his mind could defend itself. His chest tightened. His throat burned. The carefully maintained distance he'd built between himself and consequences collapsed in an instant. Sarah's hands didn't shake. Her eyes did. They carried fear, yes, but also something heavier, resolve sharpened by desperation. She wasn't here to ask. She wasn't here to explain. Whatever had driven her to this door had already stripped her of hesitation. Maxwell saw it clearly now. This wasn't an emotional visit. This was survival pressing its weight into flesh and bone. The suitcase at her feet wasn't packed for comfort. It was packed to leave everything else behind. He realized he hadn't spoken. He realized he couldn't. Words crowded his mind and died before reaching his mouth. Apologies came too late to matter. Questions felt dangerous, as if asking the wrong one might shatter whatever fragile balance was keeping her standing there. His silence stretched, thick and suffocating, and still Sarah didn't move. She watched him, searching his face for something. Permission, regret, maybe proof that she hadn't made a fatal mistake coming here. The baby shifted slightly, a small sound escaping its lips, barely audible. That sound anchored the moment in reality. Maxwell felt something unfamiliar crack open inside him. Not fear, not anger, regret, raw and immediate, stripped of justification. It wasn't the slow regret of memory or hindsight. It was the violent kind, the kind that arrives all at once and refuses to be rationalized away. He had faced death calmly. He had ordered men into darkness without flinching. None of that prepared him for the sight of Sarah standing at his door, carrying a life he didn't yet understand but already felt responsible for. The hallway behind her remained empty. No footsteps, no voices, no safety net. Whatever had brought her here was still out there. And as Maxwell stood frozen in the doorway, the city breathing below them, one undeniable truth settled into his bones. Midnight had stopped being quiet the moment she knocked, and nothing in his carefully controlled world would ever return to what it was before. The silence after the door closed felt heavier than the silence before it had opened. Sarah stepped past him without asking permission, her shoulder brushing his arm as if the space already belonged to her, as if she no longer had the strength to negotiate entry into his life. That single act told Maxwell more than any explanation could have. She wasn't here to test the ground. She was here because there was nowhere else left to stand. He turned slowly, watching her move deeper into the penthouse, her steps careful but determined, adjusting her hold on the baby with instinctive precision. The suitcase remained by the door, unattended, a quiet reminder that this wasn't a visit. It was an arrival with no return address. She stopped near the edge of the living room, where the city lights spilled faintly across the floor, and only then did she speak. Her voice was low, steady, stripped of drama. "He's 3 months old." The words landed without ceremony, without accusation, and somehow that made them heavier. Maxwell didn't respond. His attention had already dropped to the child in her arms, to the small rise and fall of the baby's chest, to the undeniable proof of breath and warmth and existence. The child wasn't crying. He wasn't restless. He slept as if the world had never given him a reason not to trust it, and that innocence unsettled Maxwell more than fear ever had. He stepped closer without realizing he'd moved, drawn by something he couldn't name. The baby shifted slightly, a soft sound escaping him, and one tiny hand emerged from the folds of fabric, fingers curling instinctively around Maxwell's thumb as if guided by something older than logic. The contact was brief, almost accidental, yet it sent a sharp, breath-stealing tension through his chest. This wasn't abstract. This wasn't hypothetical. This was weight and warmth and life responding to him without judgment. His pulse thudded loudly in his ears, and for the first time since Sarah had arrived, the penthouse felt too small to contain what was happening inside him. "Leo," Sarah said then, her eyes never leaving his face. "I named him after your father." The name struck with surgical precision. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't manipulative, it was honest, and honesty cut deeper than intent ever could. Maxwell's jaw tightened as memories surfaced uninvited. His father's voice, his lessons, the way legacy had always been framed as something earned through sacrifice. He had spent his entire adult life trying to outrun that shadow, believing that distance was protection, that separation was strength. Standing there now, with his son's fingers still loosely wrapped around his thumb, the lie of that belief became impossible to ignore. Distance hadn't protected anyone. It had only delayed the cost. Sarah shifted her weight slightly, the fatigue in her body revealing itself in small, involuntary movements she could no longer fully hide. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and there was a tension in her shoulders that spoke of months spent on alert, listening for sounds that might mean danger. Maxwell noticed things he should have seen earlier, the way she positioned herself so her back was never fully turned, the way her gaze flicked instinctively toward windows and corners, the way her grip tightened at the faintest noise from the city below. She wasn't just tired, she was worn down by vigilance. "I didn't come here to accuse you," she said quietly, as if reading the conflict on his face. "And I didn't come to ask for anything tonight." The pause that followed was deliberate, measured. "I came because running stopped working." The words hung between them, unfinished but heavy with implication. Maxwell felt the weight of everything she wasn't saying pressing against his ribs. He wanted to ask where she'd been, what had happened, why now. The questions crowded his mouth and stayed there. He knew better than to force answers before understanding the cost of hearing them. Instead, he stepped back slightly, creating space, gesturing toward the couch with a hand that didn't quite feel like his own. It was the first invitation he'd extended in years that carried no calculation. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before sitting, exhaustion finally winning the argument she'd been holding inside her body since arriving. The baby stirred, but didn't wake, settling again as if reassured by stillness. Maxwell remained standing, unsure of where to place himself in a room that suddenly held something more valuable than anything he'd ever owned. The penthouse, once a fortress, now felt exposed, its glass walls less like protection and more like confession. He looked at the child again, at the softness of his features, the quiet certainty of his existence. He had built an empire on control, on foresight, on anticipating threats before they materialized. None of it had prepared him for this. No amount of power explained how to hold a future that had already begun without him. No strategy accounted for the ache spreading through his chest, sharp and unfamiliar, as he realized this life had continued, grown, breathed, without his presence. Sarah watched him closely, not with expectation, but with caution, as if she were measuring whether the man standing in front of her still had the capacity to choose something other than himself. The baby shifted again, letting out a small sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Maxwell swallowed, his gaze lifting to meet Sarah's, and in that moment a quiet, terrifying question settled between them, one neither of them voiced, but both clearly understood. What happens now that the past is no longer distant and the future is already breathing in his arms? The city continued its distant hum outside the windows, indifferent and unchanging, but inside the penthouse, something irreversible had taken root. Maxwell knew, with a clarity that left no room for denial, that whatever he had left behind had found him again, and this time it wasn't going to wait for him to be ready. They moved through the days like shadows circling one another in a room too small for honesty, too heavy with the weight of what had been left unsaid. The house itself seemed to hold its breath whenever they were in the same space, each footstep, each rustle of fabric echoing like a warning. Sarah had made it clear from the start that she would not forgive easily, would not trust blindly, and Maxwell understood that. He had not come back to demand anything. He had come back to face consequences he had long avoided. Still, the way she avoided his gaze, the way her hands clutched Leo with quiet desperation, made him realize how much he had underestimated the fragility of what he had destroyed. Every glance she gave him was measured, careful, as if she were testing whether he was still the same man who had once walked away. And in the way she carried herself, Maxwell could see that she was both strong and fractured, determined to survive but terrified of what it would cost her. In the evenings, when the house fell into a brittle silence, Maxwell found himself lingering in the hallways, watching her from just beyond the reach of light. He noticed the subtle tics that fear had carved into her, the slight flinch when a door slammed too loudly, the half-turn of her body before answering him, the way she never let Leo out of her sight for more than a heartbeat. It was not just vigilance, it was armor shaped by months of solitude and betrayal. And though he had thought he understood the consequences of his choices, seeing her like this struck him harder than any threat he had faced in his life. He realized that leaving had done more damage than the world ever could. His absence had taught her how to distrust even the safest spaces, how to carry anxiety as an uninvited companion, how to make love feel like danger. That knowledge made his chest ache, not with desire or longing, but with the sharp sting of responsibility too heavy to bear. Sleep offered no refuge. Sarah's nights were broken by small, instinctive movements, rocking Leo when he whimpered, holding him close when shadows passed across the window pane, waking at every unfamiliar creak in the house. Maxwell had tried to leave her to it at first, believing she needed her space, but he soon found himself drawn to the edges of her presence, compelled by a combination of guilt and a longing he did not yet admit even to himself. One night, he stood outside her bedroom door, watching the soft rise and fall of her chest, the delicate way she adjusted Leo in her arms, the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed exhaustion and fear. Her hair fell loose around her face, catching the dim light in strands of gold, and for a moment, he forgot to breathe. He wanted to step forward, to say something, anything, but words had lost their meaning long ago between them. And yet, as he watched, he realized that there were truths she might never voice aloud, and that some of the damage he had caused could never be undone, only endured. The breaking point came quietly, almost imperceptibly, the way tension always does before it snaps. Sarah was sitting near the window, Leo in her lap, staring out into the gray winter night. Her body was coiled with restraint, every muscle tight as she rocked the baby, her lips pressed together so firmly that Maxwell feared she might bleed from the effort. The silence between them stretched taut, and then, without warning, she spoke. Her voice was low, brittle with exhaustion and emotion, and it cut through the quiet like glass. "I hated you," she said, not looking at him, not needing to, as if the words were intended for herself as much as for him. Maxwell felt the room shift. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to speak, to justify, to take back the past, but he remained frozen. The words fell into the space between them and lingered, sharp and undeniable. Then she added, almost as an afterthought, "And I still loved you. That's the part that nearly destroyed me." The confession did not seek forgiveness. It demanded acknowledgement, and it left him unarmed. When Maxwell finally spoke, it was with a careful deliberation that he had long since perfected in boardrooms and back alleys alike. "I thought fear made me strong," he admitted, his voice low, barely above a whisper, his gaze fixed on the floor rather than her face. "I thought control was the same as protection." He paused, swallowing the weight of shame that seemed to press against his ribs. Then he lifted his eyes, meeting hers for the first time since her confession, and in that gaze there was no anger, no hatred, only a guarded attentiveness that was more frightening than rage. "All it did was teach me how to be alone," he finished, the words tasting like regret and blood. Sarah did not respond immediately, but he could see the faint tremor in her jaw, the subtle catch in her breath, the quiet acknowledgement that the truth had landed where it mattered most. The night stretched on with this fragile equilibrium. No promises were exchanged, no apologies were uttered beyond the silent acknowledgement of shared pain. They existed in a suspended space, a liminal zone where every movement, every glance, every whispered sound held the potential to collapse everything they were tentatively rebuilding. Maxwell would find himself lingering near the nursery doorway, watching her tend to Leo with a care so fierce it both thrilled and terrified him. She never looked at him while she moved, yet he could feel her assessment in every cautious step, in every measured sigh. And Sarah, for all her defenses, found herself noticing him in subtle, reluctant ways. The way he softened when he watched Leo sleep, the small gestures that betrayed the man he wanted to be rather than the man he had been forced to survive as. But neither of them could speak of it, and that silence became a weight heavier than any confession. Then came the first unexpected disturbance. A shadow in the hallway, a knock at the door that neither expected, a ringing phone that jolted them both awake at 3 a.m. For the briefest of moments, Maxwell saw the old instinct return, the need to control, to protect, to dominate the environment. But it was tempered now by fear, not of enemies outside, but of losing what fragile trust had begun to form between them. Sarah's body tensed, Leo stirring in her arms, and for the first time, Maxwell realized that danger need not always be physical. The threat of losing each other, of letting the past seep back in and poison the present, could be just as lethal. He reached for her hand instinctively, but she recoiled slightly, as if testing whether this was habit or genuine intent. The moment stretched unbearably, and then the intruding sound faded, leaving only the echo of what might have been, an omen that nothing in this fragile home could ever be taken for granted. Days bled into nights with the same meticulous caution, punctuated by brief, shivering moments of emotional honesty that neither of them dared to name. Sarah spoke little, but when she did, her words cut sharper than any accusation. She reminded Maxwell, silently and without malice, of every failure, every absence, every choice that had wounded them both. He listened, acknowledging nothing with words but carrying everything in the tightening of his chest and the restless pace of his nights. Yet in these unspeaking exchanges, a tenuous bond formed, one woven from the shared recognition of pain, the mutual acknowledgement of imperfection, and the unspoken desire to somehow survive together despite the fragile ground beneath them. It was precarious, unstable, and terrifying, and that terror was what made it real. Danger never waited politely. It never announced itself with the courtesy of a knock or a warning. It arrived like a shadow at the edge of vision, a presence that made the hairs on your neck stiffen and your pulse quicken before you could even name it. Maxwell had always lived with that awareness, a sixth sense honed by years of surviving in a world that demanded vigilance at all times. Yet tonight, it landed heavier than ever, as if fate had chosen to remind him that the life he had built, the choices he had made, and the sins he had buried were not confined to memory or distance. They followed him relentlessly. A black sedan lingered too long outside the building, engine idling like a coiled predator, tires grinding quietly against the asphalt as if testing whether it could be heard. Maxwell didn't need to see faces through tinted windows. He felt the intent radiating from the vehicle like a low hum in his bones, a warning that what came next would be sudden, and it would be irrevocable. He moved without thinking, every muscle coiling and snapping into motion. Leo was in his arms before Sarah could respond, his small body pressed against Maxwell's chest with the trust only a child could give. She followed immediately, hands grasping his jacket as if anchoring herself to the one solid thing she could still rely on. The air smelled like metal and tension, thick with the electricity of fear. Then it began. Gunfire erupted, shattering glass and spraying the world with shards that glittered against the fading light. The walls, once symbols of safety, crumbled in their minds to paper-thin barriers, useless and impotent against the violence that had found them. Maxwell dropped to the ground instinctively, spinning to shield Leo, counting seconds that felt like lifetimes, calculating exits while instinct screamed at him to fight, flee and protect, all at once. Sarah clung to him, her face pale but determined, eyes wide with the terror of what she had never imagined living through. When the echo of the final shot subsided, the world around them was changed. The air hung heavy with the acrid scent of burnt gunpowder and something far more permanent, the knowledge that nothing in this life could be guaranteed. Blood had found its way to the pavement, sticky and red, proof of consequences far larger than their immediate survival. Sarah's hands trembled as they grasped the fabric of Maxwell's jacket, as if holding him tightly could tether her to safety. He felt it then, not the fear of dying because he had stared death down too many times, but the raw, unfiltered terror of losing what mattered most in that instant. Not just the child he now bore responsibility for, but Sarah herself, the fragile, wounded woman whose presence had reignited in him the part of himself he thought was long dead. "This life," he said, voice low but urgent, carrying a weight that Sarah had never heard in him before, "follows me everywhere." There was no arrogance in the statement, no bravado. It was a confession, a warning, a burden laid bare. She met his eyes, steadying herself despite the rapid pounding of her heart, the tremor in her fingers, the adrenaline still flowing through veins that had moments before faced near certain death. "Then don't let it take us too," she said, words soft yet carrying the quiet fire of a resolve that refused to break. And for a heartbeat the world seemed to pause, as if listening to the fragile promise between them. But the pause was deceptive. Danger had not left. It had merely changed shape, gone quiet to wait for its next opportunity to strike. The sedan remained in the shadows outside, engine now silent but menacing, its presence a constant reminder that the world Maxwell had tried to leave behind had found them. The building itself seemed to shrink, the walls bending inward with tension, creaking ominously with each gust of wind that rattled the windows. Every corner, every hallway, every staircase was suddenly a potential ambush. Maxwell's eyes scanned relentlessly, memorizing exits, calculating angles, noticing every reflective surface where a gun might appear, every shadow that could conceal an enemy. Sarah clutched Leo tighter, whispering soft reassurances to a child too young to understand the danger, and he realized how much he relied on her composure, even as he vowed silently to himself that nothing would reach them. Not tonight, not ever. Time lost meaning. Moments stretched and compressed with terrifying elasticity. A siren wailed in the distance, barely audible over the silence of the tense street, and yet it was close enough to remind them that they were not invisible. Maxwell's mind raced through contingencies, escape routes, backup plans, and yet none of it mattered. The threat was immediate, personal, and intimate. Whoever had sent the car had chosen this night, this building, this moment to remind Maxwell that the past could not be outrun. Sarah's eyes darted to the windows, to the faint glimmer of reflections on the black paint of the sedan, and he could see the same questions there that haunted him. Why now? Who? How close? Every instinct in him screamed to move, but they could not flee blindly. One wrong step, one miscalculation, and Leo's life, Sarah's life, His own life would be over in an instant. He could feel the city breathing around them, distant car horns, the faint rustle of leaves, the subtle vibrations of approaching footsteps. Every sound sharpened the tension. Every silence made the seconds drag with unbearable pressure. He dropped his weight slightly, shielding Leo further, listening for the faintest hint of motion, the shuffle of a foot, the click of a safety being disengaged. Each microsecond demanded attention. Each decision could be fatal. And through it all, Sarah remained anchored to him, small but unyielding, a presence he could not abandon, a lifeline to the one thing that still mattered. And then the first movement came, an almost imperceptible flicker of shadow at the corner of the building. Maxwell's muscles tensed like coiled steel, heart hammering in rhythm with the unspoken promise of violence. The car door opened quietly, a single figure stepping onto the pavement, silhouetted by the dim light of the street lamp, features obscured. Maxwell's mind cataloged every possible threat: weapon, accomplice, ambush, exit. Sarah's grip on him tightened imperceptibly, her small frame rigid as though ready to spring into action despite her fear. He spoke no words. There was no time. The world had narrowed to that single figure, the black sedan, and the unyielding urgency to protect those he loved at all costs. The seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. A single wrong move, and everything would collapse. Maxwell shifted slightly, adjusting Leo's weight, moving imperceptibly towards Sarah to shield her, all while keeping his gaze locked on the figure emerging from the shadows. Every instinct screamed threat, but something in the figure's movement, subtle and deliberate, hinted at a knowledge of him, a past that had not been forgotten. And in that realization, Maxwell understood the depth of the danger they were in. It was not just random, not just violent, it was personal. Sarah's whisper cut through the tension, almost lost to the night. "Maxwell, what do we do?" Her voice was small, tight, but laced with determination, a reminder that she would not let herself be passive even in terror. He did not answer immediately. There was no plan that could fit the immediacy of this threat. The only response possible was action, and it had to be precise. Every heartbeat, every tremor of the ground beneath them, every distant siren became part of a calculation only he could make. And as the figure took another step forward, the air thick with impending violence, Maxwell realized that the world he had built, the life he had tried to leave behind, had arrived to claim its due. Nothing would ever be the same. The fragile bond they had begun to nurture, the tentative trust slowly forming in the aftermath of past betrayals, would now be tested not by words, but by fire, by bullets, by the merciless unpredictability of a world he could never escape. And even as he shifted Leo to a safer angle against his chest, even as Sarah's small hand found his jacket, fingers digging in as though it could anchor them against fate, he felt it, the unshakable truth that his presence, his choices, his very existence carried danger like a shadow. And the question that haunted him more than any gunfire, more than any threat, was this: could they survive it together? 5. The world seemed muted afterward, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears like a physical weight, heavy with what had just transpired. The adrenaline that had surged through their veins, the sharp edge of terror, began to dissolve slowly, leaving behind a residue of exhaustion, raw nerves, and unspoken truths. Maxwell sank onto the couch with Leo still tucked securely against his chest, the boy's small body warm and unthreatened despite the chaos that had just passed. Sarah leaned against him, her own trembling form seeking something steady in the storm, her hair falling in loose strands over her face, softening the harsh lines that fear had carved into her features. The air between them was thick, charged, but not with danger this time. It was something quieter, heavier, almost sacred. And yet, despite the temporary peace, the room seemed to whisper reminders of what could still come. Shadows in corners that might yet harbor threats Maxwell could not see. She spoke first, voice low, almost hesitant, as if she had rehearsed the words in her mind 100 times before daring to let them escape. "I didn't come for protection," she admitted, her tone neither proud nor apologetic, only honest. "I came because I still believed you could be better." Maxwell's throat tightened. The weight of her belief was heavier than any enemy he had ever faced, more binding than chains or bullets. He had left once. Thinking distance would spare both of them further pain, but her words now reminded him that absence had never been safety. It had been surrender. The life they shared, fleeting as it had been, had created a fragile bond that neither danger nor time could fully sever. And hearing her voice, stripped of any pretense, made him realize just how much he had underestimated the courage it took for her to come back into his world, knowing it was still dark and unforgiving. Maxwell swallowed hard, feeling the tension in his chest tighten as he gathered his own truths, ones he had buried beneath walls of power and habit. "I left because I was afraid," he said, the words trembling despite the calm he tried to summon. "Not of enemies, of loving you more than power." The confession hung in the air like smoke, curling into corners and settling in the spaces where the echoes of their past still lingered. Sarah's hand, small and warm, moved instinctively to rest against his chest, over the heart that had once walked away from everything for pride, now beating fiercely with unspoken promises. She did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, thick with the weight of memories and almost forgotten fears, giving both of them the space to realize that love in this house would no longer be assumed. It had to be earned, carefully, painfully, and without shortcuts. Leo stirred then, shifting slightly in Maxwell's arms, small breaths punctuating the tension between them. Maxwell adjusted his hold instinctively, brushing a loose strand of hair from Sarah's face, his fingers lingering on her cheek, not with possession, but with apology, recognition, and a desperate hope that the future might be different. In that quiet, fragile moment, the walls of the room seemed to contract, enclosing them in their own small universe where only these three lives mattered. Yet outside, the faint hum of the city reminded them that danger had not gone away. Shadows from past enemies, the lingering presence of the black sedan, and unanswered questions about who had orchestrated the attack all pressed against the edges of their fragile sanctuary. Each of them understood silently that tonight's escape did not guarantee tomorrow's peace. They moved closer without words, a careful negotiation of space that spoke louder than any confession could. Sarah rested her head against Maxwell's shoulder, not in surrender, but in an act of cautious trust, a test of whether the man she had once loved could now match the courage she had displayed in returning. Maxwell felt it all, the fragility, the weight of responsibility, the sharp edges of guilt, and the first tentative spark of something else: hope. It was not easy, and it would not be simple. Every heartbeat carried the memory of what they had lost, every breath a reminder of what could still be destroyed. Yet even amid exhaustion, even amid the unspoken fear of what lay beyond these walls, love began to creep in again, patient, deliberate, slow, refusing to be forced or assumed. Hours passed with a quiet rhythm, broken only by the occasional shift of Leo, the soft scrape of fabric as Sarah moved, and the whispered promises that Maxwell dared not voice aloud. His mind wandered to the choices that had brought them here, the betrayals, the violence, the absences, and he realized that the world he had lived in had shaped him into a man both capable of protection and haunted by loss. Sarah's eyes caught his across the dimly lit room, and in that glance was a challenge, a question, a demand for honesty that he could not avoid. The world outside might still carry threats, might still try to claw at their fragile peace, but in this room, With Leo between them, there existed a small truth that neither gunfire nor shadows could erase. They were together, and for now, that was enough to anchor them against the storm. Yet even as love returned, slowly, painfully, it was tempered with caution. Maxwell understood that each moment of closeness was a potential vulnerability, each tender touch a risk that someone or something could exploit. His fingers lingered on Sarah's skin, tracing lines of apology, of acknowledgement, of remorse, and yet the weight of history pressed down on him, reminding him that trust was fragile and mistakes were permanent. Sarah sensed it too. Her hands never relaxed fully, her eyes scanning even as she leaned closer, her instincts honed by months of carrying Leo alone, by nights of fear she had never allowed to fully dissipate. Together they formed a careful equilibrium, one that teetered constantly between connection and caution, desire and vigilance. Outside, the night remained alive with potential threat. The distant hum of engines, faint footsteps on pavements, and the occasional clink of metal reminded them that peace was never absolute. Maxwell's mind calculated, replayed, and prepared, not out of paranoia, but necessity. He knew the moment they let down their guard entirely, the fragile sanctuary of this apartment could be shattered, and with it the tentative steps they had begun to take toward one another. Each heartbeat in the quiet, then, became a measure of life, love, and vigilance, a rhythm that bound them together in ways words could never express. And yet, amid all the tension, amid all the fear, amid all the shadows that loomed unseen, there remained the undeniable pulse of hope, slow but insistent, refusing to be extinguished even by the ghosts of their past. The quiet that had settled over their fragile bond after the recent chaos proved to be temporary. Maxwell thought the most dangerous threats had come from the streets, from faceless enemies, from violence external to their lives. But life has a way of delivering the sharpest knives from behind, and this one came in the form of someone Sarah had trusted above all, her mother. The revelation arrived subtly at first, in casual remarks, in the way her voice would falter when certain names were mentioned, in small inconsistencies she could not entirely disguise. Sarah felt it before she understood it, a tightening in her chest, a chill that no blanket could warm, the prickling suspicion that someone had been watching, feeding information, turning safety into a trap. Her heart raced not from danger itself, but from the betrayal of someone she had loved, someone who should have been her shield. When the truth finally landed, it shattered her entirely. Her mother, the woman she had confided in, the one who had helped her plan to escape Maxwell's dangerous world and protect Leo, had been leaking information to his rivals. Each detail of her past movements, every choice she had made to stay hidden, had been shared with people who wanted to destroy Maxwell's empire, and by extension, endanger the life they were beginning to rebuild. Sarah stared at the floor, her mind trying desperately to reconstruct how the woman she had trusted could have justified such actions. "For your own good," her mother had said, words that now felt like daggers. But it wasn't protection. It was control disguised as concern, and Sarah realized, with a sickening weight in her chest, that her own safety, Maxwell's safety, and even Leo's life had been compromised by the very person she had expected to stand beside her in this fight. Maxwell, when Sarah finally revealed the truth, did not rage. He did not shout. He did not demand vengeance, although his instincts screamed that this betrayal should not go unanswered. Instead, he held her, arms wrapped around her as she crumpled, her tears soaking through his shirt. His jaw was tight, rigid with restraint, the muscles coiled as if ready to strike at anyone who dared threaten them, but his voice remained steady. "No more secrets," he said, the words carrying both command and promise. The quiet intensity of a man who had endured loss, who had learned that reaction without control could destroy everything worth keeping. "No more running." Sarah clung to him, shaking, exhausted from fear, from grief, from the sudden realization that the world she thought she had some measure of control over had betrayed her in the most intimate way. This wasn't a reunion anymore. It was not a rekindling of something fragile and half-forgotten. It was a choice, a conscious decision to fight together, shoulder to shoulder, or to fall apart separately, leaving themselves and Leo vulnerable to the dangers that circled just beyond the edges of their lives. The weight of that decision settled over them like a storm cloud, heavy with consequences, with possibilities both terrifying and fleeting. Each second of silence that followed carried the echo of potential threats. The rivals who now had knowledge, the mother whose betrayal cut deeper than any weapon, the streets outside still alive with danger. Every breath they drew felt measured, deliberate, a part of a calculus designed to keep them alive just a little longer. Sarah's hands trembled in Maxwell's embrace, gripping his jacket as though holding on could anchor her to reality. Her mind replayed every moment, every word her mother had said, trying to make sense of the manipulation, the lies, the betrayal. How had she been so blind? How had she placed trust in someone who would weaponize it against her? The question spiraled without answers, leaving only the cold certainty that she would never, ever allow herself to be so vulnerable again. Maxwell's presence offered both solace and tension, comfort in the safety of his arms, but tension in the awareness that she could not ignore the risks still lurking in the shadows. Maxwell's mind, sharpened by years of surviving in a world that required constant vigilance, cataloged the consequences, the threats, the potential fallout. He considered their next steps: confront the mother, cut her out entirely, reinforce their security, anticipate moves from the rivals who had been alerted. Every plan had risk. Every hesitation was a potential vulnerability, yet he allowed no outward signs of panic. Instead, he focused on Sarah, on the fragile human reality that their bond required more than survival. It required trust, rebuilt from the ashes of betrayal. The quiet between them was tense, filled with unspoken questions. Could Sarah forgive this? Could he ensure it would never happen again? Could they survive the treachery that had found them even within the walls of what should have been sanctuary? The night stretched on, long and oppressive, with only the soft breathing of Leo breaking the stillness. Every small sound outside, the faint creak of a floorboard, the distant rumble of traffic, the rustle of leaves against the windows, triggered Maxwell's instincts instantly. Sarah, too, had learned vigilance, though hers was wrapped in fear rather than training. Her hands never left his jacket for more than a second, every movement a quiet test of whether the person holding them both was still the protector she had come back to believe in. And in that shared, tense rhythm, they found a new understanding. Safety could no longer be assumed, love could no longer be taken for granted, and every moment of togetherness would need to be earned, protected, and fought for against a world that had proven itself merciless. But even amid fear and betrayal, there were flashes of fragile hope. A glance, a brush of a hand, a shared breath, the small intimacies that reminded them of the life they could still have if they chose to defend it together. Maxwell's fingers traced the line of Sarah's jaw, the curve of her cheek, his touch deliberate and patient, not demanding, not possessive, but communicating the silent promise that he would not let another threat come between them, not while he breathed. Sarah's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted words she could not summon, and in that hesitation lay the tension of 1,000 unspoken truths: fear, anger, grief, and the slow, careful stirring of love that refused to die despite betrayal. The betrayal of her mother was a knife in the back, yes, but it was also a test of their resilience, a crucible through which their bond would either harden or shatter. Maxwell's mind calculated every risk, every step they must take, the enemies they could anticipate, the unknown dangers that waited to strike. And yet he allowed himself to stay in the moment with Sarah, feeling the weight of her against him, the subtle tremor in her hands, the small sounds of Leo breathing between them. Every second was charged with consequence. Every movement was fraught with tension. And yet, in the quiet, Maxwell made a decision. They would not run. They would not hide. They would face the threat together, and whatever came next, they would do it as one. Even as the night pressed in around them, shadows stretching along walls, streetlights flickering in distant windows, every instinct in Maxwell screamed that danger could strike at any moment, that the world was still filled with men who had been given information and would act upon it. Sarah's grip tightened, sensing the weight of unspoken decisions, the knife-edge reality of their lives. The city beyond their walls had become a landscape of uncertainty, yet inside, with Leo sleeping and Maxwell's arms steady around her, there existed a fleeting sanctuary built not on walls, but on resolve. A silent, almost imperceptible agreement passed between them. No more secrets, no more running, no more betrayal allowed to dictate the terms of their lives. And yet the night was not done. The faintest sound, a car door clicking shut, a distant shout, a footstep on the sidewalk, was enough to pull every nerve taut. Maxwell's hands tightened slightly on Sarah's shoulders, and she flinched, a mixture of fear and trust shining in her eyes. The world outside remained unpredictable, a threat as real as the knife of betrayal that had cut into their lives. Each heartbeat was a reminder that their choice, to fight together rather than fall apart, was only the beginning. They had chosen each other, but the world they inhabited was ruthless, and every step forward demanded vigilance, courage, and a willingness to confront the darkness lurking in every corner. Months passed, and the world they had fought so hard to survive outside remained just as violent, unpredictable, and unforgiving as ever. The streets below the penthouse windows hummed with life, lights flickering in a city that refused to sleep, indifferent to the small victories and losses of those who inhabited it. Inside, however, a fragile warmth had begun to take root. The penthouse, once an echo chamber of cold walls and isolation, now vibrated with something softer, something stronger, the presence of life and laughter. Leo's small feet pattered across the wooden floors with a rhythm that had once been impossible here, a sound that filled corners that had long been haunted by silence. Maxwell moved through the rooms with a watchful ease, attuned to every small sound, every flicker of shadow, every sign that his family was safe. But now, the vigilance had a different flavor, no longer only fear, but a protective tenderness rooted in love that had been earned, not assumed. He found himself watching Sarah more than he watched the city, more than he watched threats that might arrive at any door. One evening, she stood by the window, shoulders relaxed, hair loose, the city lights reflecting in her eyes like shards of gold in a dark sea. She looked both luminous and fragile, a contradiction Maxwell could not reconcile, and he realized he had spent months craving this vision, longing to witness her peace without intrusion, without threat, without the shadows of betrayal lurking at her back. He approached her silently, steps careful, not wanting to break the quiet rhythm of the moment. She did not turn immediately, and for a heartbeat, he felt the old weight of fear return, the instinctive terror that any misstep could undo what they had begun to rebuild. "I can't undo what I did," he said softly, voice carrying a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show, even in private. The words were not a plea, they were a confession, the acknowledgement of the mistakes that had defined his life and haunted every step he had taken toward her. Sarah didn't respond right away, her gaze fixed on the city that spread infinitely before them, a mirror to the world that had tested them endlessly. Her silence was not cold, it was measured, reflective, the kind of silence that demanded thought before response. Maxwell shifted slightly, bridging the small distance between them, his fingers brushing against hers in tentative contact, a question and a promise wrapped into one small, deliberate gesture. When she finally spoke, it was with the slow deliberation of someone who had learned patience through fear and betrayal. "That's all I ever wanted," she said, her hand reaching for his, allowing their fingers to intertwine in the quiet glow of the city lights. The gesture was simple, almost ordinary, yet it carried the weight of months of struggle, of trust, rebuilt brick by brick, of love tested by fire and choice. Maxwell felt the tension drain from his chest in a way he had not realized he needed. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe that presence, commitment, and protection were not merely transactions of power, but acts of devotion, small daily rituals that could forge a future they had once thought impossible. Leo stirred between them, a soft sound that pulled both adults back from the edge of introspection, reminding them that life, with all its fragility and beauty, demanded attention, care, and courage. Maxwell adjusted the child in his arms, feeling the warmth of his son's small body against his chest, the rise and fall of breath that was so ordinary and yet miraculous after months of danger and chaos. Sarah rested her head against his shoulder, allowing herself the comfort of proximity without fear, without hesitation. It was not surrender, it was choice. And in that choice, Maxwell recognized the rare, unshakable truth. Love, rebuilt from honesty, was stronger than any illusion, more durable than any wall, more powerful than the fear that had once driven them apart. The penthouse itself seemed to exhale with them, the echoes of the past dissipating into quiet corners, replaced by the soft sounds of a life being constructed with care. Every room held a memory of the chaos they had endured, yes, but also the promise of safety earned through vigilance and resilience. Maxwell walked through the space slowly, hand brushing against furniture, against walls, taking in the signs of ordinary living. Leo's toys scattered with careless joy, a blanket thrown over the couch where Sarah had napped in exhaustion, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. These details, mundane to anyone else, were monuments to survival, to endurance, to love that had fought through the darkness to find light. And yet, outside, the city remained unchanged, violent, restless, unconcerned with the fragile sanctuaries that humans tried to carve from it. Maxwell felt the edge of that world even here, the sense that threats were never far, that the past could reach forward with claws, sharp and intent. But for the first time, he did not recoil. Instead, he allowed himself to breathe, to observe, to stand as a man who had learned that presence was more than posture, that protection was more than preparation. He had chosen to stay, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of commitment, to Sarah, to Leo, to the fragile family that had become the center of his life. The night deepened, shadows pooling along corners of the penthouse, and Maxwell realized that love did not erase fear. The knowledge of danger, of enemies waiting, of betrayal lurking in the world remained constant. But he also realized that it could coexist with hope, that vigilance could exist alongside tenderness, and that being present, being human, being committed, these were the acts that defined courage as much as any battle or confrontation. He turned slightly, capturing Sarah's gaze, and in that moment, everything else, the streets, the enemies, the violence outside, fell away. It was just them, just Leo, just the quiet trust that had been hard won, and that trust was armor stronger than any wall, stronger than any bullet or knife or shadow that might appear at the edge of their lives. Time seemed to bend gently around them. Maxwell and Sarah, hands intertwined, shoulders touching, hearts synchronized in the quiet rhythm of survival and devotion, found a stability that had eluded them for so long. Maxwell spoke again, softly this time, words almost drowned in the faint city hum. "I will not leave. I will not let the world take what we've built. I will stay." Sarah's eyes glimmered, reflecting both the lights of the city and the emotions she had spent months containing: relief, love, fear, hope, and a quiet courage. She pressed her hand to his cheek, leaning closer, and in that small, intimate gesture was a universe of trust, a promise that no betrayal, no violence, no shadow could undo. Leo's laughter soon followed, filling the room with life that had been absent too long, a reminder of innocence preserved and nurtured despite the chaos that had marked their lives. Maxwell watched the child, then Sarah, then the space they all shared, and felt a sense of completeness he had never known. It was not perfect. Nothing in their world would ever be. But it was earned. It was fragile, yet strong. It was real. Midnight had opened a door before, one that once led to loss and regret, but this time the threshold had been crossed and held firm. Maxwell did not walk away. He did not hesitate. He stayed, fully present, fully committed, and fully aware that the life they had rebuilt together, though shadowed by past dangers, was worth every risk. The night continued, and as the city lights flickered against the windows, the penthouse glowed softly with warmth, laughter, and life. Maxwell and Sarah, bound by trials, choices, and truths, moved through the quiet with the awareness that love, tested and deliberate, could survive even the harshest world. Each touch, each glance, each shared breath reinforced a bond forged not in illusion, but in honesty, courage, and perseverance. The threats outside remained, but inside, a sanctuary had been built, a life that had been claimed through strength, vulnerability, and the relentless act of staying together. And in that quiet amidst shadows and city lights, Maxwell understood finally that presence, truth, and choice were the ultimate victories. Midnight had changed everything. And this time, Maxwell did not walk away. And that was today's story on Heart-Woven Tales, a journey of love, choices, and the courage to stay even when the world is against you. I hope it touched your heart as much as it touched mine. Remember, love rebuilt from truth is stronger than any obstacle life throws at us. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like, share it with someone you care about, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more unforgettable tales. Until next time, stay strong, stay loving, and keep your hearts open.